Now that we have the background script running, we're one step closer to setting up our timer functionality. But of course, the problem is that our set interval call actually goes to sleep when the service worker goes to sleep. And the only way around that is actually through a Chrome API. And I already have the documentation open for it, but it's a special Chrome.alarms API that actually allows code to run inside of a background script, even if the service worker goes to sleep. And it does this using some Chrome magic that we can kind of just appreciate. And the first thing you'll notice is that the permissions does require an alarms permission. So let's go ahead and add that to our manifest file. And then there are a bunch of methods inside of the alarms API, but what we'll look at first is the create method. So we'll see that the alarms.create method is called by doing chrome.alarms.create. And the first parameter is an optional name of the alarm, because in the case where you have multiple alarms, you can give each of them a name, and then when the alarms fire, you can do specific actions based on which alarm fired. But in our case, we only want a single alarm that fires every 1 second to work as our timer. So we won't worry about the name. But we will need to pass in this alarm info object. And if we actually click on alarm create info, it tells us the properties of this object. And the only one that we're actually worried about is period in minutes, because the period in minutes will determine how long in between every alarm event. So if we set period in minutes to 1, what happens is that the alarm event will fire every 1 minute. But if we do 1 divided by 60, then the alarm will fire every 1 second, because 1/60th of a minute is 1 second. And the delay in minutes and the when option allow us to specify the time at which the very first event fires. So you can delay it for 5 minutes before you start setting up your alarm, or you can specify that the alarm should start at 10 p.m. tonight. But in our case, we always want the alarm to be running in the background, which is why we don't have to worry about these two fields. So now that our alarm is created, there is another method you can see in the event section called onAlarm. And this is how we actually respond to the alarm events, because every 1 second an alarm event is going to fire. So we'll do chrome.alarms.onAlarm.add_listener, and it takes in a callback function with an alarm object, which for now we'll just console.log. So let's refresh our extension and inspect our service worker. And you can see every 1 second our alarm is firing. Okay, so now that our alarm is firing every 1 second, we actually need a way to store time. So let's actually use our Chrome storage again. And this time we're going to use local storage, since our timer isn't something that is likely to be reused across browser sections. So we'll do chrome.storage.local.get, and then we'll pass in the timer key. And then inside of the callback function, we have our result object. And since we don't have a default value set for our timer key, sometimes it might not exist. So we'll create a time variable. We'll use that null coalescing operator again and set it to 0 if res.timer doesn't exist. If res.timer does exist, then this time variable will be equal to whatever the time is that is saved in storage. And then inside of chrome.storage.local, we're also going to set the value of time and increment it by 1. So we'll set timer equals to time plus 1. And then one thing that we're going to do while we're at it is inside of our pop-up, currently we set badge text to this text time every time we open the pop-up. Well, let's actually remove this set badge text. And what we're going to do inside of our background alarm instead is we'll do chrome.action.setBadgeText. And then we're going to set the text equal to the time. So we have to convert this number into a string, and we'll just do time plus 1, so that the number in storage is synced with the number on the badge. So if we reload our extension, we can see that on our badge, the timer has now started incrementing. Okay, so now that our badge timer is working, let's add in that timer to our pop-up. We'll head into our HTML, add another h2. I'll give the ID of timer. And then inside of our pop-up, we'll do const timer elements is equal to document.getElement by ID is timer. And what we'll do is a chrome.storage.local.get, and we'll retrieve our timer value. We'll have a callback with our results object. And then again, since our timer value might not always be defined, we have to do res.timer, ? And then if it's not defined, we'll set it to 0. And then we'll set timer elements.text content is equal to a template string. Timer is at, and we'll just pass in time value. And then we'll also say seconds afterwards. Okay, so if we refresh our extension, open it up, we can see our timer is at 103 seconds. But we'll notice that actually the badge time is still incrementing, but our pop-up time isn't incrementing. And that's because currently our local storage runs a single time when we open the pop-up. We need to be checking storage every second in order to make sure that our timer value is always getting updated properly. Because if we reopen the extension, it'll update the time. But while the extension is open, the pop-up won't actually update. The way around that is to actually just wrap this inside of a function. We'll call it update time elements. And then we'll just pass in just this entire chrome.storage.local function. And we're also going to pass in our locale time string, because if you see in the pop-up, the number of seconds is actually counted inside of that time. And currently, that's not being updated every second either, even though it really should be. So we'll also move this inside of update time elements. And then we're going to create a set interval call that calls update time elements, and we're going to have it call it every second. And then also, right at the start, we're also going to need to call update time elements so that there isn't a delay for loading the timer, since the set interval call doesn't actually call right away when we open the pop-up. It actually waits 1 second before its initial call, which is why we have to do a call by ourselves. So now, if we open the extension, we can see that our timer is now in sync with our badge text, and that our locale date string time is also updating.